everyone. I'm Eliza Sherman. I'm the CEO of Ellementa, and you are tuning in to our book club, the Ellementa Book Club, where we speak with authors of wellness books. Now, a lot of the books happen to be about cannabis and CBD, but we have other authors coming up soon. One in particular that doesn't exactly mention cannabis or CBD, but could be read and used with cannabis and CBD. It's called The Orgasm Book. That's a new edition from Nicole Hodges. So that's coming up in, I want to say May. Yes. We also have Alana Frankel coming up with Women and Weed in April. Robin Griggs coming up in March with Pot in Pans, the history of eating cannabis. I wanted to also just double check and do a quick plug for my book with Dr. Janella Chin, Cannabis and CBD for Health and Wellness. Commercial. Okay, enough. Enough commercials. Let's get on with the show because we are running a little bit late today, but better late than never. Here is the book we'll be discussing today, The Little Book of Cannabis by Amanda Siebert, who is right there. Did I say your name properly? The last name. Okay. So for some reason you are muted. I'm unmuting you, or you need to unmute.
How's that? Can you hear me now?
Yeah, I can definitely hear you now. So there's a couple of things we're going to talk about. First, we usually want to know how you got started with cannabis. And I did read in your intro that you started at age 14. You also made a little comment like, that might be shocking to some people. Though I know a lot of people and a lot of women who started quite early with their cannabis use and at the time didn't realize it could be healing or medicinal. Yeah. And then you kind of learn that as you go along. So I want to hear a little bit about your story, and I'm sure everyone here would like to do that as well. Also, I wanted to mention a little bit in each chapter, if we can, just sort of touch on some highlights. What I really like about the book, very journalistic.
That is my career.
I know, you're a journalist. And I mean that in a really good way. It is very organized, and it has a structure and a flow, and there's a lot of citations at the end. So when I was writing my book with Dr. Janella Chin, we had pages and pages and pages of research that we referenced, but the publisher was looking more for the front end stuff versus the back end. It's almost like your notes in the back are a chapter unto themselves.
It's true.
There's so much in there, which is great. So anyone who's looking to say, well, what does the research say? Or anyone who says, well, there's no research out there. There's very little research out there. Yeah, that's not true. And what I love about your book is that you were able to pack a lot of it in there and then reference it as you go along. So I found that to be really, really helpful about this book. So first, why don't we just start with your story? How did you get started with cannabis? And then how did your relationship with cannabis change over the years?
Okay. Well, as you said, the first time I ever used cannabis, I was young. I was in high school, and at that time, it was just sort of experimentation. I wasn't using consistently, or using it consistently, and probably until I turned 19 or 20, until I was in college. And at that time, I used cannabis to sort of de-stress. It was sort of my, being in college. Consuming alcohol was like so common for people that I went to school with, and I wasn't always up for that. I would rather, in a lot of cases, I would rather, smoke a joint and relax and not have to deal with the hangover the next day. And I found that, it did help me really get through the stress and craziness of school, and also being in your early 20s. I mean, it's a wild time. So I really relied on it in that sense. To sort of, in a therapeutic sense, relieve stress and anxiety. And I was doing a lot of physical activity at that time too. So topicals and things like that for sore muscles. It wasn't until later in my life that I started using it more purposefully in terms of medicine. Actually, while I was writing The Little Book of Cannabis, I was diagnosed with post-traumatic stress disorder. And it's not funny, I guess, but it's interesting the way it happened. I had sort of been experiencing some weird symptoms, and you know, I sort of chalked it up to, oh, this is just, you know, this is just the stress of life compounding. I have so many things going on. But while I was actually interviewing someone for the book, Dr. Zach Walsh, we were talking about cannabis and PTSD. And he was listing off all of these symptoms. And in my mind, I sort of had a checklist going, and I was like, oh yeah, I'm experiencing that and that.
Oh,
and
like
that.
what? Like what kind of symptoms? Can you
Like just
specify that?
like night terrors and fits of rage and sweating all the time, even though I was cold, and just having really like frightened by, you know, things that were not scary, just
like hyper alertness,
hypervigilance for sure.
Hypervigilance.
Yeah.
How about did you have because I suffered from PTSD after being held up at gunpoint.
Oh Lord, I'm sorry.
Many years ago.
Yeah. Oh,
Thank goodness it was many years ago.
Yeah.
We caught them all, and they're all in prison.
But
the one thing that I experienced, which I had no idea at the time, was I would faint. I would get out of bed and faint, and they thought I was hyperglycemic or hypoglycemic.
Yeah.
And PTSD can change your physical body and the hormones, and so your endocrine system gets out of whack. And so I was, in a sense, I had very low blood sugar, but it was completely connected to PTSD.
Yeah, totally. I didn't experience that, but I did experience rapid weight loss and like zero appetite. And I thought, you know, oh, this is just because I have so much going on. And it turned out that no, that was not the case. You know, the result of trauma, obviously we all have it, and we all have things we need to deal with. And I'm grateful that cannabis was there for me to sort of move through that. Obviously I had to put the book writing on hold for a little while I, you know, went to therapy and sorted myself out. But I was lucky to have, you know, editors that were really supportive. And it's just sort of adds, for me, I don't know, it adds to the value of the book, because I myself have, you know, used it in that medicinal way now. And really now the way I look at my cannabis use, it's sort of like, you know, it's a scale. Like sometimes if I'm feeling really in the throes of my anxiety, then I'm using it a little bit more. But lately it's kind of less common. And so I think it's interesting to talk about the way our use changes throughout our lives, and when it's more, you know, recreational. I don't know if I buy that. I think all use is a little bit therapeutic.
I agree.
Whether we're self-medicating or not, you know, we're getting something out of it, right?
Yeah, I think you're right. And what we've always said is, because we always talk about health and wellness at Ellementa, but what we say is even just simply relaxation, reducing social anxiety, or laughter. Laughter is the best medicine. So just
of course it is.
having a giggle and is a great way just to feel good and to lift the spirits. And so all of that is therapeutic, even if you're not thinking, I'm taking this as medicine.
Yeah, of course.
How do you like to consume your cannabis?
I do like to smoke it. I know that it's, you know, the less looked at as kind of the not the greatest way to consume. I also have a vaporizer, and I guess I sort of go in between the two. From time to time, I'll have an edible if I really can't sleep, if I'm, you know, my mind is racing. Sometimes as a writer, that creative juices, they don't start flowing until like 10:30 at night sometimes, and I'm like, wow, this is not the time. But yeah, you know, I think I sort of vary back and forth depending on where I'm at in my anxiety, in my, you know, sleep schedule. But for the most part, it's either I guess it's inhaled, you would say, yeah. So either smoke.
So inhalation. Sure. Well, it's the most rapid onset, as we always like to tell everybody. So we never like to say this way is bad, this form is bad. The only thing that I would say as a definite is check the additives, check it for pesticides and molds and things like that. Those are bad.
Yeah, you want to make sure you're consuming clean,
exactly. Debbie also, who's in the audience at the moment, said that she suffers from complex PTSD and uses cannabis daily, and it helps her with anxiety and overwhelm, but not as much for depressive symptoms. I think you mentioned in your book also that depression was something that you were diagnosed with.
Definitely, yeah. And that one is a little bit more, you know, I myself personally have benefited from using cannabis when I'm feeling depressed. I find that it helps me turn off that negative voice in your head that, you know, when you're in the throes of depression or whatever, and you just, oh, I'm such a piece of crap or whatever. It allows me to sort of remove myself a little bit from those thoughts. And that for myself has been beneficial. I know that for some people, you know, cannabis can have an adverse effect for depression. So it's really about, and it also depends on the type of cannabis you're consuming. I mean, if I'm using a strain or a cultivar that's a lot higher in CBD, I find the effects are even greater. I know that, you know, THC sometimes, if you're consuming too much of it, it can also have that reverse effect with anxiety. It might make you more anxious. So just learning about how your endocannabinoid is expressed in your own body and how you react to things. Sometimes it can be a bit of a learning process, but yeah, in my case anyway, it has sort of helped me crawl out of the pit of depression at times in my life, for sure. So
it's interesting because, but not writing the book, but starting my company is when I began to really learn about the benefits of cannabis for myself. And I particularly gravitate towards CBD or CBD heavy things. It seems to reduce anxiety and reduce inflammation, which is, you have a chapter on aging. So really quickly, for those of you who don't have the book in hand, we're going to go through each of the we're going to go through each of the chapters, and this is in the order: sleep, stress and anxiety, mood and creativity, metabolism, weight management and exercise, superfood, sex, pain management, cancer, aging, and as an exit drug. So let's see. Let's start with sleep. Now, before I go on with the chapter breakdown, what I want to say also about the book is how each chapter, when I had said it's structured and it flows. So you start with a case study, which is great, real life example. And it's so interesting that you're also a case study for the book. As you were writing the book, you suddenly became a case study. So it's case study. There's also, in the middle of that chapter, historical uses. So every chapter talks about historical uses, which I love, because we actually did, I think chapter 2 in our book is just all history timeline of centuries of use of cannabis, particularly by women, but not just women. And then you've got how to use it afterwards. So one of the things in the sleep chapter, and I've written a lot about sleep, not just for the cannabis book, but another book I wrote with Beth Cantor called The Happy Healthy Nonprofit, the importance of sleep.
Oh, yes.
That sleep can change everything for the better or for the worse. And you pointed something out, which I think is super important. Everyone who says they take CBD for sleep, I always wonder about that, because you even cite that a study shows that about even as little as 15 milligrams of CBD at night could cause alertness. And that's what I've always understood. So yeah, tell me a little bit about CBD and sleep.
So what I've written about CBD and sleep in the book touches on the difference in amount. So CBD is one of these compounds that is what we call biphasic. So in smaller doses, it might act different than it does in larger doses. And I think that one of the studies that I reference in the book, in the chapter on sleep, talks about the efficacy of CBD for sleep. But I think in that study, subjects were given a dose of like 600 milligrams before they went to sleep, right? And so much larger than 15, 20, 50 milligrams even of CBD. For myself, I haven't experimented too much with CBD and sleep, so I can't really speak to that. But I thought that was really interesting. And so when I hear people say that, oh, like CBD is really helping me with sleep too, I wonder, I'm like, how much are you consuming? And it also gets really costly, right? If you're using 600 milligrams a night, that's not going to be
a lot. So I take in about 30 milligrams a day in the mornings.
Okay. And it keeps, is that like your cup of coffee? Or do you...
Well, that's usually after my cup of coffee. Or it could be with my cup of coffee. Yeah. And to me, it's sort of just helps me stay even keel, but also addresses the inflammation. So I have arthritis in my neck, and which also keeps me from sleeping sometimes. So but with the CBD, I use it as a daily thing and not as a nighttime thing. But I couldn't even imagine if I'm taking 30. I can't imagine like how you would take 600.
Yeah.
Although,
granted, this was all under a, in a lab setting and
sure, but also you can take much more easily through capsules, for example.
Yep, much easier.
High dose capsules would be a lot easier to consume higher doses. But here's what it can do, though. I think it doesn't make me sleepy, but it does help with the anxiety and racing mind that keeps people from falling asleep.
Totally. And I was just going to say, you mentioned pain and inflammation. I mean, if pain is keeping you awake at night and 20 to 50 or whatever milligrams of CBD before bed helps take that away, then it is going to help you sleep. It's just a different, and also with anxiety as well. If you calm the mind and you can get to sleep better, then maybe you don't need 600 milligrams of CBD before you go to bed.
Right.
Yeah.
Did you have anything, and I can't remember offhand, about THC? Because THC can make you very sleepy. And it's not even just the THC, though. It's the CBN, right? The CBN is much more of the sedative. But I heard that if you have too much cannabis, too much THC, that you don't actually enter into that restful REM state.
Yes. So that in the book I speak with Dr. Perry Solomon. He is the chief medical officer for HalloMD. And he talked to me about these different stages of sleep. So this is actually where cannabis can be really helpful. And we talked a little bit about PTSD, but if you're suffering from night terrors, so the idea is that all of these dreams and things are happening in the REM stage of your sleep. There is a stage before that, I forget what it's called offhand, but that cannabis can actually improve. That is also a restorative stage of sleep. It's just not full REM sleep. So yes, THC can sort of interrupt your sleep at that REM stage, but for individuals who are suffering from night terrors or bad dreams or things that are waking them up at night, that can be a good thing. And I cover in the book as well that, our understanding of these different stages of sleep and what's more valuable than the others. You talk to a bunch of scientists and they all have sort of a different idea of what's the most valuable. So really it all boils down to what is the best for you. If maybe you're losing out on a little bit of REM sleep, but you're getting a solid, 8 hours of sleep a night and you're not waking up, perhaps you're getting benefit anyway. So yeah, I think again, it varies from person to person.
Well, and we definitely have to emphasize that it's very individual. Anything you read in the book, anything you read online, anything anyone tells you, it's not necessarily going to be the same thing for you.
Totally.
So always like to emphasize that. Anything else on sleep before we move on to stress and anxiety?
I don't think so. Stress and anxiety it is.
Stress and anxiety. Okay, here we are, stress and anxiety. One of the things that you were mentioning in the book is low doses of THC, even at 2.5 milligrams. It can have quite an effect. Maybe not as much of the perception altering effect per se, but you can feel it. And for some people, it can be quite relaxing and quite de-stressing, like that glass of wine that many women in particular, I find, turn to their glass of wine every evening as that de-stressor. But that comes with all kinds of other things.
Of course.
The weight gain, you wake up in the middle of the night after a glass of wine. Sugars.
Oh, totally. I mean, I think it's a bit of an illusion that, wine will make me sleep better. I mean, you might fall asleep quicker, but you're going to wake up in the middle of the night. You might feel like crap the next morning. But
that is sort of the stress reliever. But cannabis as a stress reliever. Talk a little bit about that.
So cannabis, you mentioned that there are sections in each chapter that talk about history. So what I found really interesting when I was doing this research was the sort of historical references to cannabis as a stress reliever. Because I think sometimes we view stress and anxiety as this like modern problem, because we all have so much going on and we're all so busy. But what I really liked reading and including in the book was sort of the ways it was referenced. So for instance, in early texts authored by the Sumerians of Mesopotamia. So that's a long time ago, one of the first civilizations in the world.
Very, very long time ago.
Yeah, they actually referred to cannabis, the plant, as the plant for forgetting worries, which I think is really, I don't know, I thought that was, I think that's so poetic. I'm a writer. Like I read that and I was like, oh, that's That's great to learn that, you know, so long ago it was already perceived in this way. You know, in another ancient text written by Emperor Shen Nung of China, he refers to it as a plant that lightens one's body. I think that's another, like, really, I don't know, beautiful
very evocative way of explaining it.
Totally. And the last one I'll mention is the Atharva Veda, the Atharva Veda, which is a Hindu text, called it the plant that provides freedom from distress. And so these are three things that I thought, oh wow, you know, to see it used in this way historically really speaks to, you know, I feel like there's a lot of doubt. You know, you mentioned about the research and things like that about anxiety and stress and mental health. But if you go back this far and you see that it's been used in this way, I feel like that counts for something. But yeah, when we get into the use of cannabis for stress and anxiety, I often, you know, if people come to me and they're like, oh, I'm stressed out, what's the first thing, you know, I should look at, or what's the first thing I should do? I often suggest CBD first. Just because, you know, some people don't have a great reaction to THC. Like we mentioned earlier, you know, sometimes THC does have the ability to exacerbate your anxiety a little bit. So starting off with something that's, you know, CBD dominant, or maybe 4-to-1 or something, so that there's a little bit of a buffer there. Or, you know, if people are interested in starting off with THC, having a CBD only substance around as well, like a tincture or some capsules. I mentioned in the book as well that, you know, CBD can actually counter the effects of THC, the negative effects. So if you're feeling really anxious because you've taken too much THC, you can actually use some CBD to counter that a little bit. So that's kind of, if I have, you know, 30 seconds with someone and they're asking a question about that, that's kind of something I would suggest. Is always, you know, start with CBD, and if you're going to use THC, have some CBD on hand.
That is something I mention pretty much every single webinar, is that idea of CBD being antagonistic as well as synergistic with THC, but the antagonistic piece will temper the effects. I love that tip. Let's move into mood and creativity.
Yes.
Talk a little bit about the use of cannabis for mood and creativity. Mood and creativity often going hand in hand.
Totally. So this chapter, I mean, part of it touches on, you know, mood disorders and things like that. Like I talk a little bit about depression in it. But what I found really compelling was this link between mood and creativity. And some people ask me, you know, why did you put these two things in the same chapter? And there's actually a study that I found that sort of links them in a way that when you're in a more positive mood, you're actually, you know, more likely to be creative. That's sort of summing it up in very simple terms. But the chapter sort of centers around how to improve both aspects, you know, to bring about a little bit of creativity. And the reason I included that, I mean, being a creative individual and you know, taking in all of this art all the time, you know, music and certain things that have been inspired by cannabis, I thought it important to include that in the book a little bit. But yeah, in terms of mood, I think using cannabis for mood is so very personal. Something that might work for myself to improve my mood might not work for the next person. It's sort of like the sativa indica debate where, you know, but yeah, for myself, like if I'm looking to kind of lift my spirits a little bit, or sit down in front of my computer and maybe my brain isn't turning the way I want it to before I start to write, I like to consume a little bit of I guess what you would traditionally call a sativa, or a more uplifting variety, like a Maui Wowie, or you know, something that's
a little more stimulating.
A little bit more stimulating, but not super high in THC, because I find sometimes that can just be a little bit, you know, a little bit too much, or maybe I'll get a little bit sedated and then things don't get done.
Right, and then you're not as productive as you'd like to be.
Of course. But yeah, I think mood is definitely an area where there's a lot of ongoing research happening, and certainly still things that need to be studied. But yeah, it was really interesting to conduct all the research for that. And I often get questions from people like, oh, is there any research to back this up? And so it is, you know, you mentioned the references in the back. Lots of them.
Yeah, there's definitely. And a very, very teeny weeny tiny type as well. There's a lot in there, jam packed, which is good, because I think it adds a level, like a trust factor. The fact that you have been so meticulous with your citations and have been able to publish all of them in the back of the book is, I think, a really helpful thing. Let's move on to number 4, metabolism, weight management, and exercise. And it's so true. When I was reading that chapter, most people are surprised that cannabis could be used for weight management, particularly because we're all probably super familiar with the concept of the munchies, and certain kinds of cannabis will stimulate your appetite. In fact, that's why it can be so helpful to anyone with a wasting disease, or anybody with cancer and nausea from chemotherapy, or anyone who's having trouble just having an appetite. It can lift that. But on the other hand, there's something in cannabis that, if you have a lot of that present, can curb an appetite. And what is that? What's that cannabinoid?
THCV.
Yeah.
More and more research coming out on it. But at the point that my book was published, it was a little bit minimal, but I was able to sort of include a little bit about that. And I think that's very exciting, because we have this idea in our head, this trope of the cannabis user that goes home and gets high and eats everything in their fridge and is perhaps, unproductive. And I think it's great to have the science throw that out the window. Some of the research that I include in the book, there is some research just to show that cannabis users might consume as many as 600 more calories a day than a non-consumer. But there's also research to show that cannabis users actually, over the long term, have healthier glucose levels in many cases. Their blood pressure is better, and they have smaller waistlines. So these are all markers for cardiovascular disease. So this study that was conducted by Dr. Denise Vidot at the University of Florida, she was surprised by the results. She thought that, cannabis users, because they're consuming more food, perhaps, that their risk for cardiovascular disease would be higher. But she actually showed that they're 54% less likely to develop cardiovascular disease and symptoms associated with that. So I thought that was really interesting.
Yeah, that definitely is. And then you also talk about exercise and metabolism, but exercise, the recovery from working out really hard, and then afterwards the sore muscles and all. I know CBD and topicals, both THC and CBD topicals, can be very helpful for joints, muscles, muscle strain, inflammation, as we've been talking about. I think that is really good for people to know as well. And the idea of working out while you're high. I know a lot of women who do elevated yoga.
That's a good way of putting it. I like that.
Yeah, I think one caveat there would be just be really careful, especially if it takes balance.
Yeah, of course. Yeah, know your limits.
Yeah, know your limits. Know your limits. Yeah.
Yeah.
You, in chapter 5, you talk about superfood. Cannabis is a superfood, and it's so funny. I always say that, and I say it's a superfood. It's a super plant, just because of the abundance of cannabinoids and terpenes and flavonoids and everything that's in it that it then interacts with each other. So talk about the superfood aspect of cannabis from your standpoint.
Totally. So it's funny, in that chapter, I actually interview Robin Griggs, who I think is going to be on one of your upcoming book clubs. She's wonderful. I really enjoyed chatting with her about it. Now, I'm like crap in the kitchen. I'm not much of a chef, but
me neither. Forget about it.
Yeah. Speaking with her about, the different ways we can include cannabis in our food. So not just, the parts that contain THC and CBD, but also, the leaves and all of that was really interesting. She mentioned to me that one of her favorite things to do with the leaves is to make a pesto. But I think that's
like basil or something.
Totally. And I've been itching to try it since I wrote this. I need to get on it. But just, learning about all the other vitamins and minerals and things that are in the plant that we don't really get to talk about because we're, constantly talking about what's in the buds. I think there's some definitely really wonderful uses for, juicing cannabis, things that you can do with the whole plant. I know that it's obviously going to be trickier if you're living in a state or a part of the world where you can't actually grow it, but if you can grow it at home, I think the benefits to the individual of, you know, consuming all those other parts is huge, potentially. Not to mention, obviously, you know, being able to infuse your food at, you know, the dose that you prefer. I know that can take time to develop, but you know, speaking with individuals who use cannabis medicinally in that way, you know, making their own butter, making their own, you know, infused foods, I think it's incredibly freeing to be able to produce your own medicine in that way. So definitely I would call it a superfood. And I really want to experiment with it a little bit more myself. I haven't done that.
Well, I'm not that handy in the kitchen, and I would prefer not to be in the kitchen, but something like juicing would be easy. And then the benefits too come from the raw plant and a cannabinoid, the acid form of the cannabinoid. So the acid form of THC, which is THCA, doesn't get you high, hasn't been warmed, heated, or combusted to activate, but it does have a lot of benefits as well. And I think, well, we're going to have a webinar in March with Emma Chasen, who talks about the different cannabinoids and is going to talk about some of the newly discovered cannabinoids, which is very exciting. But the acid forms of these cannabinoids are also helpful and could be medicinal as well.
Yeah, it's true.
So sex. All right. Well, we just finished this month a session on cannabis and CBD and intimacy. We try to do every February, we have our sex topic, and then throughout the year as well. But I think it's a really important topic, first of all, because we hardly ever talk about it.
Yeah, I think it's very important. I mean, I know a lot of women who experience, you know, unpleasant periods, or maybe they have endometriosis, maybe sex is painful for them. And cannabis can really be a wonderful addition in the bedroom, you know, not only to help with pain or with arousal, but to quell pain, or to kind of quiet the mind a little bit if you're feeling a little conscious,
anxious,
or, you know,
because with women especially, it's a lot of mind, not just body reaction, but it's also frame of mind that can completely influence your experience.
Absolutely. And I think using cannabis in this way, it doesn't necessarily mean ingesting it or inhaling it. You can use it in a topical or in a lubricant or in a suppository. I think there's definitely more and more opportunities for women to kind of bring this about into the bedroom, and it's super empowering. I think it's really allows you to sort of come back into your body a little bit in these instances. What I really liked as well in writing this chapter, it's obvious, I'm a little bit of a history nerd, so reading about the historical ways that cannabis was used for sex was really fascinating. Let's see, what's one of the things I mentioned is, you know, in 7th century India, cannabis was sort of considered an aphrodisiac. It was used in conjunction, with Tantra and yoga, and even the Vikings. So they had a goddess named Freya, and they associated her with cannabis. So every sowing and harvesting season, they would have this massive festival, and they would use cannabis, and it would sort of be this, you know, giant sex party, if you will. But to read that,
those Vikings.
That was really
Yeah, I think that's, and I really like the fact that you wove history into all of this, because it grounds us in the knowledge that this isn't a new thing. And just because things are being very commercialized right now, and you know, the investors and the marketplace and all of that, and the manufacturers, and it is something that has been used as ancient medicine for so long, and part of rituals, and part of just the enhancement of different aspects of life. I think that really tells us a lot more than just what we're seeing right now with all the commercialization of it. Pain management. I mean, we've talked a lot about the reduction of inflammation. We haven't really said the word analgesic, and THC and some of the other cannabinoids can be, can have an analgesic quality to it, which also can reduce pain. One of the things that I have noticed about THC, and I've read about this as well. It can remove you, and I think you were saying this about something else, where it just sort of removes you away from some of the thoughts. It can also
Yeah,
remove your brain a little bit away from the pain,
totally.
the thought of the pain. And
Mm-hmm.
so, even though it may not eliminate pain, it's much better than opioids,
Mm-hmm. Yeah,
and it helps just alleviate some of that stress of pain, if that
totally.
makes sense.
Yeah, it does. I
Oh,
think what
yeah.
you might be referring to is a quote in the book from Dr. Mark Ware. So he's
Okay. Yeah.
a pain specialist who works with cannabis in Montreal. And the way he described it to me was his patients had said to him that cannabis doesn't take the pain away from me, it takes me away from the pain.
Oh, that's
Right?
it. Yes. Yeah.
Yeah. And I thought that was
Memory,
so
a little memory thing, but
yeah,
yeah,
there's a little bit
that
of
is
trade
exactly.
off there.
I'm like, oh, yeah,
Yeah.
that's great.
And I thought that was such a great way of describing it because, you know, I mean, I don't suffer from chronic pain, but I have used cannabis in instances of, you know, temporary pain. And yeah, it definitely, you know, you're still aware that it's there, but you're able to sort of move on with your day and function and do things. And then again, you mentioned, you know, versus an opioid, it's obviously doesn't come with all these addictive properties. A little bit easier to manage. And so I think that was a really interesting thing to hear him say, because you often, you know, people like to argue with does it actually, you know, get rid of your pain? But to hear it spoken in that way kind of.
Well, and that's the thing. We're not saying this is a cure-all. This is not the magic bullet. And it can help in a lot of ways, because when you can cut that pain cycle, when you can give your body and your brain a break from that cycle of pain in particular, that's when the healing can really start. So we can facilitate healing by removing some of the really exacerbated aspects of pain. And then the inflammation reduction, half the time our pain comes from inflammation or nerve pain, for example, like, or neuropathy, something like that. I've heard it can be extremely effective. As topical, and I always say too, when it comes to pain, take it both ways. So take it, ingest it. If it's acute, then inhalation will be fastest, but the ingestion of it reduces that inflammation. And then topical. So you're layering it. So you're addressing the localized pain, but then so for me, it's here. I reduce the localized pain, but then I also systemically am working on it as well.
Totally, yeah, multiple pronged approach, if you will.
Exactly. Cancer. We talked a little bit about that a little bit earlier, but talk to us about cancer. What did you find out about cannabis and CBD use for cancer?
I found some interesting things. I want to note the title of this chapter as well, though, because I know that cancer is a very sensitive subject for some people, and I make it very clear in the book that cannabis is not a cure on its own. The chapter itself is called "A Powerful Support for Cancer Treatment." So, good. I think it's important that people recognize that, you know, traditional medicine for something like cancer, chemotherapy and radiation, yes, these are very hard on the body, but using cannabis in conjunction with those treatments has been shown to, you know, increase the likelihood of someone's recovery. It can, you know, cannabis use during those treatments can actually relieve some of the side effects. And so I think it's important for people to recognize that, like, yes, cannabis is great and can help relieve a lot of the side effects of cancer, a lot of the symptoms that come with taking, you know, different medications and things like that. But it's important for us to sort of look at this holistically and not just, you know, write off Western medicine entirely when it comes to cancer treatment. So that's my preface.
Well, that is really important for people to know, that we're never saying stop everything else and go straight to cannabis. The other caveat is cannabis or CBD can affect medications you're taking.
That's very true as well.
Often make them more potent. Not necessarily block, but some of them can block. And somebody also said, one of the doctors we spoke with said it's like grapefruit. So when there are medicines that react to grapefruit, then you need to really consider that also if you're using cannabis and CBD.
Of course, yeah. So definitely more of a nuanced subject. But in that chapter, I speak with Mara Gordon, who has been formulating cannabis medicines for cannabis, or pardon me, cancer patients.
Right, yes.
For a very long time. And so, something that she pointed out was, be wary of people who are just selling, cannabis products geared to cancer patients on the internet. Be careful about where you're obtaining your medicine, because if you're immunocompromised and you're dealing with something like cancer, you have to be very careful that the medicine that you're using is of high quality, that you're not going to have any anything left over in the tinctures or the oils or capsules that you might be using. And if you're inhaling product, it's also very important that that's clean of pesticides,
clean and
like
pure.
You can really make your health a lot worse by not being careful about the type of cannabis products that you're using, especially when you're suffering from cancer. So
some friends of ours, they have a company, Dr. Rob Farms, and the entire inspiration for his cultivation was to have the cleanest cannabis available, particularly because he was inspired by his mom who had cancer, and he wanted to make sure her medicine was clean. He wanted to give her the benefits of cannabis, and then grew specifically to have very, very clean plants. And so that is important when you're taking cannabis as medicine, because of all the things that could be in it. Aging. Let's talk about cannabis and aging.
Yes. So this chapter definitely doesn't circle around like wrinkle reduction or sort of the sort of more surface things you think of when you hear the word aging. The reason I decided to include this chapter, I was really struck by a woman I know. She's the case study in the chapter. Her name is Selena Wong, and she actually used cannabis tinctures and sort of edible products for her elderly grandparents as they were approaching death. They were kind of anxious and afraid of this new, and so for her, cannabis was sort of able to facilitate a more gentle experience around all of that. And I thought that was just incredible. There's other studies and stuff that I reference in the book that talk about, could cannabis potentially reverse or help with Alzheimer's and dementia and things like that. And from an anecdotal perspective, I've heard many instances of elderly people sort of coming around and changing their minds on cannabis, and then being able to get in touch with themselves a little bit, and a state of lucidity, if you will. And so for family and caregivers and people who are surrounded by that, it can be a really beautiful healing, I guess, addition to treatment for someone who might be going through age-related disease. So I was really happy to include that, and I think it's something we don't really think about. I mean, you hear often that seniors are the fastest growing demographic of cannabis users. I know, at least in Canada, I think in the States as well, if I'm not mistaken. So this I find very encouraging. I think just to see it used in that way can be it's something that people don't really think about.
So when I think of aging, since I am middle age, I don't think I'm a senior yet. I think I'm about 10 years away from senior status. But aging, particularly in these middle years, and for women in particular, our bodies have changed over the course of, prepubescent, the adolescence and starting your period, and then perimenopause, which could be a stretch of 5 to 10 years of up and down, all these symptoms, moving into full menopause, which I'm about 6 years into full menopause. But again, not a senior, but in this whole stretch and the changes that you go through, cannabis, particularly in really small doses, or even just CBD for those who can only get that, can alleviate all the, not just disease and conditions that occur with aging, but sort of the symptoms, the issues that come up. And I'm not really much of an inhaler now because of just my own personal preference. I prefer not edibles per se, but sort of ingestibles. I don't like tablets and capsules, but I prefer like mints. Mints are really great. There's a product other friends of ours called Highland Pantry.
Ooh.
And they have 3 levels of mints: mini, midi, and more. And they're very specific about their ratios of CBD to THC. So it's very CBD forward. And their tagline, one of their taglines is that it's for boomer babes. But it's really meant for the aging woman who wants to just simply feel good or feel better than they have with all of these hormone fluxes and everything that they're going through. And I think something like that can be a great way to ease into aging, because aging can be super stressful. Coming to grips with your mortality can be super stressful. Not even talking about end of life, which I agree that it can be an amazing thing. But getting you through this tumultuous 10-year period, anything would be great. If I had known about this sooner, I think it would have alleviated a lot of stressful, unpleasant things. So, all right, last is exit drug. Now that is, we talked a little bit about opioids. And I was of the era where I was told that marijuana is a gateway drug to heroin use. Smoke a joint, next thing you know, you're shooting up. I mean, that's literally what I learned. And this is pre-internet, so I used to go to the library, and that's what the library books told me, so you knew it had to be true. Talk about the cannabis as an exit drug.
Yes. Okay. So the idea of an exit drug is that it, rather than the gateway, that it helps you stop using other substances. In the chapter, I talk mostly about opioids, but there are studies to show that cannabis can help people who are struggling with alcoholism, all sorts of other research. I might not mention in the book, but Vancouver, where I live, there's a very serious opioid crisis going on, and it's across the country, and it's happening in the United States as well. So there's lots of data and research that's happening sort of at a community localized level, where we have these service providers who are offering up cannabis and cannabis products to these individuals who are relying on opioids. And a lot of their data has shown that not only is this reducing a person's reliance on the substance, but it's reducing the number of overdoses. It's encouraging them to use less opioids. So that chapter really centers around this concept of reducing your reliance on opioids or prescription drugs and sort of transitioning and using cannabis. Now, obviously, this is something depending on the prescriptions that you're on. Don't just go and do this yourself. Talk with your doctor, taper yourself down based on their suggestions. But basically, this chapter goes into the existing research on that, and it's something that's being studied a lot more each and every day. So I think this is really, not only is it potentially very powerful for this crisis that we have in North America, it's reminding us that these plants that we use that have been villainized for so long, it's taking that gateway drug theory and sort of turning it on its head a little bit. I find that really, really interesting. It's just, the legal stuff gets in the way of, making it more available to people who are struggling with addiction. So, yeah.
So, we're going to be wrapping it up soon, although I want to open it up to questions. Now, the questions need to come in through Zoom. So those of you who have registered and have come into Zoom, if you have any questions, feel free to type them in the chat area. Any questions from anything you've heard so far? There's a lot in this book. And I'm holding it up again for those of you watching live on Facebook. We can't take your questions on Facebook in the comments immediately, but if we see any in there afterwards, we'll make sure Amanda goes in and answers them for you. Right, Amanda?
Yes.
But I just wanted to hold up the book again for all of you so you know what we are talking about. Maybe as sort of a wrap up, talk a little bit about a few of the other surprising or interesting things that you learned as you were writing this book. I know you're the history geek, and I really, really enjoy hearing about the history as well. But anything at all that sort of popped up for you where you're like, oh, wow, that's really interesting, or that's really different, or I didn't know that. Anything
Totally.
come to mind?
I think I mentioned a couple of them. I mean, just hearing the early references to cannabis as a stress reliever in those sort of poetic terms was really neat. The data on cardiovascular disease really, I was, you know, just totally blown away by that, but excited by it. You know, some of the data that is included in the last chapter on cannabis use as an exit drug, you know, the way it's, I think I referenced one study in particular that talks about alcoholism. Just going through the list in my head right now. One second. What else did I find surprising? Oh, I think one point that I'd like to mention actually that is vital. There's a section in the book on the endocannabinoid system, and in this section, it's near the back, but in this section, I interview Dr. Ethan Russo. So sometimes people ask me, like, where should I start in the book? And if you're sort of more science-minded and you really want to know the ins and outs of what's going on in your body with these compounds, start with the appendix on the endocannabinoid system. And it is sort of talked out throughout the book, but Dr. Russo just explains it in such a brilliant sort of way that's really accessible. I find sometimes I'll go to a conference or hear someone talk about the ECS and it gets so convoluted that, you know, I think it might be a little bit scary for most new consumers or people who aren't exposed to cannabis to sort of wrap their minds around that. So yeah, I really tried hard to sort of pare everything down into a way that is digestible. A book, I guess I always tell people I wrote it with my mom in mind and my grandmother so that they could understand it too.
All right, so I'm gonna test you on this, put you on the spot a little. Okay. How would you simply explain the endocannabinoid system to someone who is unfamiliar with that?
It's a system in the body that interplays with a lot of other systems in your body. So your oh man, blanking a little bit here, but your parasympathetic nervous system. Basically, it impacts a lot of things that are going on: your movement, your thoughts, your emotions, your metabolism. Sometimes your hormones. There's all sorts of different systems that it interacts with. And so when we consume cannabis, the ECS is sort of the system that where that sort of receives the compounds, the cannabinoids that you're consuming. And I won't go into all of the receptors and that. You can read about.
I know it starts to get more and more complicated in a way, but to know that there is science behind it, to know that the ECS was discovered by scientists who were researching cannabis and how it interacts with our bodies and brains, and to know that it's not just humans that have
animals also.
Yes, animals also have an ECS as well. Not that you're supposed to be giving your dogs puffs, but they can benefit from CBD.
Yeah, I know that there's at least one group in Canada that's trying to get some real research on that, which is exciting too. So
yeah, it is. Well, just anecdotally, I give my dogs CBD and it seems to help with their anxiety, but more obvious is they tend to get really severe hot spots. And it has reduced the skin inflammation by ingesting it systemically. I tried some topicals, but the topicals aren't usually meant for pets because a lot of them have menthol or peppermint to give you the sensation. On a hot spot, that is just not going to be comfortable. But as an ingesting CBD dose, particularly for pet weight, that's how they do the dosing based on the pet weight. It's cleared up a lot. And so that's sort of an obvious benefit even for pets who dogs, cats, all have ECS, an endocannabinoid system. So we're coming to the end of our hour. I'm wondering if there is anything that you're working on now that you want to promote. Obviously, we're promoting your book, and we will continue to do so. We so appreciate having you here. Debbie mentioned something. We give our 2 cats a CBD tincture with their canned food. Our one kitty was traumatized before we got her and is really skittish. Well, pets can have a lot of trauma as well. Our dogs are rescues, and you just never, and I think all of my dogs have been rescued except for my very first pet when I was a child, and you never know what they've been through, the trauma, even just the trauma of being in a shelter. giving them CBD can be incredibly therapeutic for your fur baby, as they say. Anyhow, and let's bring it to the present. What are you working on now? What are you planning to work on, or what else would you like to promote?
Well, I'm currently editing and writing for an online publication that I founded with a few other people in the media locally here in Vancouver. It's called Inside the Jar, and we focus mostly on cannabis, drug policy, and I guess the culture surrounding that. That's kind of the focus right now. It's really exciting. We've done some long form work that looks at the marketing around prescription drugs and alcohol and cannabis. It's really cool to be able to sort of deep dive onto certain subjects, so I'm really enjoying that. As for the future, I'm hoping to write another book. I'm not quite sure yet what I'm going to focus on, but on January 1st, I said to myself that by 2021, I would have at least half a book written. So we'll see.
Okay, good for you.
Through that a little bit, but that's the goal. Yeah.
Excellent. Yeah, I know. The Cannabis and CBD book that I wrote with Dr. Junella Chin was my 12th book.
Wow.
So I'm itching for my 13th book, but I'm like torn about which direction to go in.
Yeah.
There's one that's logical to go in, and there's one that I really want to go in. And so it's just like, as a writer, it's weighing off the options, and seeing what actually flows, because sometimes the thing you're supposed to do is not the thing that you're going to write about. It's something else, which eventually you realize that is what you were supposed to do. Well, it's been wonderful having you here. I'm so glad. I'm so glad you can make it. Definitely. And we'll just keep looking at what you're up to and sharing and promoting it to our followers. So always keep in touch and let us know. Absolutely. And again, everyone, thank you for watching. Those of you who are here watching live, those of you who are on Facebook watching live, and also those of you who are watching this as a recording, because a lot of you are going to be getting this afterward to watch over and over again and to share with your friends. So thanks, and don't forget that we have a lot of other book clubs coming up, a lot of other authors. So go to ellementa.com/book club. And where can we find you, Amanda?
You can find me on Twitter and Instagram. My handle is the same. It's at Amanda_Siebert. On Facebook, just Amanda Siebert, journalist. And my website for the book is littlebookofcannabis.com if you want to go and read some info about the book. There's a couple extra blog posts and things on there. So
excellent. Good. Well, thanks again, everybody.
All right. Bye-bye.
Bye.